It stood alone, far from the reach of neighbors, far from the eyes of the world. A farmhouse surrounded by nothing but empty fields and the thick silence of the Bavarian countryside. This was Hinterkaifeck, a place that should have been a home, but instead became a tomb. The year was 1922. The Gruber family, Andreas, the aging but stern patriarch, his wife Cecilia, quiet but dutiful, their widowed daughter Victoria, burdened with secrets, and her two young children, Cecilia Jr. and Joseph, lived in uneasy isolation. Even the family's maid, Maria Baumgartner, was a stranger to their household, having only arrived a day before the slaughter. But by then, the darkness had already crept in. For weeks, strange things had been happening, the kind of small, unsettling occurrences that gnaw at the edges of the mind, making sleep uneasy and the air inside a home feel heavier. Footsteps in the snow, appearing out of nowhere, leading to the house, but never away. A newspaper found in the home that no one in the family had purchased. A set of keys mysteriously vanishing. The sounds of shuffling and scraping coming from the attic. Sounds that sent shivers through the spine, but were dismissed with uneasy glances and silent prayers. Andreas Gruber, stubborn and unyielding, refused to acknowledge the fear growing in his household. He searched the property, but found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no intruder lurking in the shadows. Still, the feeling persisted, an ever-present weight pressing against the walls of their home. Something was watching. Something was waiting. Perhaps, in the moments before their deaths, the Grubers wondered why they hadn't fled, why they ignored the signs. But by then, it was far too late, because the killer was already inside. The fear had started as a whisper, a fleeting unease that could be brushed aside with the usual excuses. Wind rattling the shutters, the house settling at night, animals stirring outside. But in the days leading up to the massacre, that whisper had become a scream, an undeniable presence pressing in on the Gruber family from all sides. Andreas Gruber, ever the skeptic, was the first to notice the footprints, a trail of deep impressions in the snow, stretching from the dense woods that lined the property. Step by step, they marched toward the farmhouse, a silent, deliberate approach. Yet there were no tracks leading away. Whoever had made them had not left. He stood at the edge of his field, staring at those footprints with a deep frown carved into his weathered face. Behind him, the farmhouse loomed, its windows staring blankly into the growing dusk. Someone had come to their home, but where had they gone? Inside, Cecilia Gruber tended to her chores, but her mind was elsewhere. The house had felt different lately, off balance, like an old chair with a missing leg. The nights were the worst. The attic, always a source of harmless creaks and groans, had taken on a new life. Strange noises drifted from above, the scuff of footsteps, the occasional thud, as though something or someone was moving just beyond the ceiling. Her husband had checked, of course. He had climbed the ladder, lantern in hand, his breath visible in the cold air as he pushed open the attic hatch. Empty. A few crates, some stored grain, cobwebs thickened the corners. Nothing out of place. But the feeling remained, the certainty that they were not alone. Then there was the newspaper. A Munich paper left inside their home. Neither Andreas nor Cecilia had bought it, and no one in their family had brought it in. It sat on their kitchen table, an intruder in its own right. A small, simple object, but one that shouldn't have been there. And what of the missing keys? Victoria, the Gruber's daughter, had been the first to notice. A key to their locked doors had vanished without explanation. It wasn't lost. No, she had seen it only the day before, resting in its usual spot. Now it was gone. But who would take it? Each event, taken on its own, was unsettling. But together, they painted a picture of something much darker. A presence that lingered, unseen but always near. And yet, despite it all, life at Hinterkaifeck continued. The family went about their days as they always had, shouldering their unspoken fears, hoping that whatever was lurking in the shadows would simply go away. But it wouldn't. It was waiting. And soon, it would make itself known. It began quietly, the kind of quiet that feels unnatural, the kind that smothers the air and presses against the walls of a home like an unseen force. The night had fallen over Hinterkaifeck, wrapping the isolated farmhouse in a suffocating darkness. The wind whispered through the trees. The animals stirred restlessly in the barn. And then, footsteps, heavy, measured, moving with purpose. No screams, no struggle, just the dull, sickening thud of metal meeting bone. Andreas Gruber was the first. Perhaps he heard something outside and went to investigate. Perhaps he saw movement in the shadows of the barn and stepped forward, a flicker of irritation crossing his weathered face before it turned to fear. A pickaxe swung with brutal force, his skull shattered. He collapsed where he stood, blood pooling in the straw-covered ground beneath him. Before the blood could even cool, Cecilia Gruber was next. Her breath caught in her throat, her mind barely able to register the horror in front of her before the second blow came. Then Victoria. Then little Cecilia, only 7 years old. One by one, they were lured into the barn. One by one, they fell. But the horror did not end there. Inside the house, Maria Baumgartner, the maid, sat in her small room. She'd only arrived that day, her first night at Hinterkaifeck, a new job, a fresh start. She never saw it coming. The pickaxe came down on her, silencing her before she could even cry out. And finally, in his crib, lay 2-year-old Joseph. A child too young to know fear, too young to understand death. But it found him anyway. 6 bodies, 6 lives extinguished in the span of minutes. And yet, the night was far from over. The killer did not flee. They did not run into the night breathless and shaking. Instead, they stayed. Among the dead. Among the silence. And whatever they did in the hours that followed remains one of the most chilling mysteries of all. The bodies lay where they had fallen. Blood soaked into the dirt floor of the barn. Warm at first, then slowly cooling in the night air. Inside, the silence was deeper than before, thick and unnatural, broken only by the occasional shifting of the house as it settled under the weight of what had just occurred. But the farmhouse was not empty. Somewhere within its walls, the murderer still moved. They did not flee into the forest. They did not vanish into the night like a phantom. They stayed. For days, neighbors would later recall seeing smoke curling from the farmhouse chimney. The cattle had been fed, their stalls cleaned, someone had milked the cows, food had been eaten, scraps of a recent meal found on the kitchen table. Someone had been living there, with the bodies. The killer, whoever they were, had made themselves at home in the Gruber family's house, surrounded by the corpses of those they had brutally murdered. They slept beneath the same roof, breathing the same air tainted with the sickly scent of drying blood. The neighbors, unaware of the horror inside, thought little of the activity. The Grubers were a private family after all. It wasn't unusual for them to keep to themselves. A few had noticed their absence in church. But rural life could be unpredictable. Illness, bad weather, or simply a desire to be left alone. No one knew that, inside, the family was decomposing, their lives already reduced to whispers and unanswered questions. Even the dog, a loyal farmhound, remained alive. When one neighbor passed by the farm, they recalled seeing the animal tied up outside. It barked at them, but there was something off about its demeanor. Not aggression, not fear, something else. Perhaps the dog knew. Perhaps it had seen something it could never comprehend. And then, just as suddenly as they had arrived, the killer disappeared. Days later, when the bodies were finally discovered, the farmhouse stood in eerie stillness. No signs of a struggle, no forced entry, no hurried escape. The only thing left behind was death. The murderer had simply walked away, vanishing into history. But the question remains, what kind of person could live among the dead? What kind of mind could sleep under the same roof as their victims, eat at their table, care for their animals? Whoever they were in no rush to leave. As if, for those few days, Hinterkaifeck was their home. For days, Hinterkaifeck sat in silence. The farmhouse stood alone, untouched, as if time itself had stopped. Smoke had risen from the chimney, the cows had been fed, but not a single member of the Gruber family had been seen or heard from. At first, the neighbors thought little of it. The Grubers were private, after all. It wasn't unusual for them to keep to themselves. But when Victoria and her young daughter failed to appear at church, something that had never happened before, whispers began to spread. Then the postman noticed something odd. The mail was piling up, letters left undisturbed, no sign of life inside the house. Finally, concern turned to action. On April 4th, 3 men from the village, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a neighbor, along with 2 other farmers, made the short journey to the Gruber farm. As they approached, the air felt thick, as if the land itself had absorbed some unspeakable horror. The dog, tied up outside, barked and growled as they neared the barn. Something was wrong. The heavy wooden doors groaned open. Inside, the stench hit them first, a thick, putrid smell that clung to the air, heavy with decay. Then, their eyes adjusted to the dim light, and they saw it. A mass of tangled limbs, half covered in hay. Andreas Gruber, his wife Cecilia, Victoria Gabriel, and her young daughter, all of them stacked atop one another, their skulls caved in, their blood long since dried into the barn floor. The men staggered back, choking on the horror before them. One of them turned and ran for the house, his heart pounding as he flung open the door. Inside, the farmhouse was still. Unnaturally still. He hesitated, his breath ragged, then stepped deeper into the dimly lit home, and that's when he found the others. Maria Baumgartner, the maid, lay slumped in her bed, her face unrecognizable, obliterated by the same weapon that had slaughtered the rest. And in the nursery, in his tiny crib, little Joseph, barely 2 years old, was dead. Everywhere they turned, there was only death. But what made the horror worse, what made their stomachs churn and their minds recoil, was the realization that these bodies had been here for days. And yet, someone had been living among them. The floors had been swept. The cows had been milked. Whoever had done this had stayed. The realization sent an icy dread down their spines. The murderer had not been in a rush to leave, and now they were nowhere to be found. The news of the massacre spread through the village like wildfire, carried by gasps and whispers, by trembling voices recounting the unimaginable horror discovered at Hinterkaifeck. By the time authorities arrived, the farmhouse no longer felt like a home. It was a tomb, haunted by the unanswered questions of 6 brutal murders. Detectives from Munich descended upon the farm, their boots crunching against the blood-stained dirt as they stepped inside the barn. They surveyed the crime scene with grim expressions, taking in the grotesque display of violence. The sheer brutality of the killings was staggering. The weapon, a pickaxe or a similar bladed tool, had crushed skulls with such force that some wounds revealed exposed brain matter. And yet, despite the savagery, there were no signs of panic, no desperate struggle. It was as if the victims had walked to their deaths willingly. Why? The investigators moved inside the farmhouse, where the horror continued. The maid, Maria Baumgartner, had been murdered in her bed, suggesting she had no idea what was happening until it was too late. But it was the nursery that left even the most hardened officers shaken. Little Joseph, barely 2 years old, had been killed as he slept. But then, they noticed something strange, something that sent chills through the room. His blankets had been neatly tucked around him. This was not the act of a frenzied killer. No, there was something disturbingly methodical about it. Almost caring. But the horror didn't end there. As they examined the bodies in the barn, they made another gruesome discovery. 7-year-old Cecilia, the young girl, had tufts of her own hair clenched in her fists. Her fingers, rigid in death, had pulled it from her scalp before she succumbed to her injuries. She had not died immediately. She had suffered. For hours, perhaps longer, she had lain there in the dark, surrounded by the corpses of her mother and grandparents, whimpering, tearing at her own hair in agony, and no one had come to save her. The officers steeled themselves against the growing unease gnawing at their nerves. They needed to find answers. Who could have done this? What kind of monster had not only killed, but lived among the dead? They scoured the farmhouse, searching for clues. But the strangeness of the case only deepened. Nothing had been stolen. The family's money, large sums of it, remained untouched. Valuables were left in plain sight. This was no robbery. This was something else entirely. And then, a chilling thought settled over them. Whoever had done this had planned it. They had been watching, waiting, stalking the family from the shadows. They had moved through the farmhouse long before the murders took place. They had hidden in the attic, listening, breathing in the same air as their victims. And when the time came, they had emerged and slaughtered them all. But the most terrifying thought of all, even with all their efforts, with all their questioning, with all the evidence before them, the investigators still had no idea who they were looking for. And they never would. The investigation at Hinterkaifeck was unlike any the German authorities had ever encountered. The sheer brutality of the killings, the eerie signs of someone living among the dead, the lack of any clear motive. It was a case that defied explanation, slipping like smoke through the fingers of those who sought answers. But while the evidence led nowhere, the whispers of theories began to spread. Some believed the murderer was someone close to the family, perhaps even someone who had been welcomed into their home at some point. Suspicion quickly turned to Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the very neighbor who had helped discover the bodies. His connection to Victoria Gabriel was well known. She was a young widow, her husband supposedly killed in World War I, and Schlittenbauer had once planned to marry her. Instead, she had remained at Hinterkaifeck, where rumors swirled of an incestuous relationship between her and her own father, Andreas Gruber. And then there was the boy, little Josef, Victoria's 2-year-old son. Who was his father? Some in the village believed it was Andreas himself. Others suspected it was Schlittenbauer. If Josef truly was his child, had Schlittenbauer killed the family in a fit of rage over a long simmering betrayal? His behavior upon finding the bodies raised eyebrows. He had seemed almost indifferent, moving and disturbing the corpses without hesitation, as if he had already known what to expect. But was this guilt, or simply shock? Another theory took an even darker turn. The footsteps in the snow, the attic noises, the missing keys. What if the killer had been living at Hinterkaifeck long before the murders? A drifter, perhaps, or a former farmhand with a grudge. Someone who had slipped into the attic unnoticed and stayed there, hiding, watching, waiting. The thought sent chills down the spines of even the most skeptical investigators. The idea that the family had been living with their own murderer, that they had gone about their days while someone lurked above them, listening, was almost too horrifying to comprehend. And yet, it fit. The strange newspaper. The missing keys. The shifting sounds in the night. The killer had been patient, methodical, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But perhaps the most disturbing theory of all was this. What if the killer was simply a stranger? Someone with no personal connection to the family. No vendetta, no motive beyond the sheer thrill of slaughter. A wandering murderer who had stumbled upon the farmhouse, claimed it as their own, and disappeared into the night, never to kill again. The idea terrified investigators more than any other possibility. Because if true, it meant the monster who had done this could be anywhere, anyone, and worst of all, they would never be caught. The massacre at Hinterkaifeck was more than just a crime. It was an infection, one that seeped into the land, into the bones of those who set foot near the abandoned farm. Because even after the investigation had ended, even after the bodies were laid to rest, something remained. A shadow, a presence, a silence that carried an unbearable weight, as if the ground itself still whispered of the horrors it had witnessed. No one wanted to go near the farmhouse. The villagers who had once gossiped about the Gruber family now avoided even looking at the property. Those who did venture too close spoke of an unnatural stillness, a feeling of being watched, of something unseen pressing against their chests, suffocating them with an unexplainable dread. Even the animals sensed it. The cows left behind refused to settle, their eyes wide with something that resembled fear. The dog, once loyal to the Grubers, was found growling at the empty barn at night, ears pinned back, hackles raised, as if warning something unseen to stay away. Or perhaps, warning the living to leave. For years the farm stood abandoned, a decaying monument to the nightmare that had unfolded within its walls. Weeds crept over the barn, reclaiming the land. The house itself seemed to wither, rotting from the inside out. Then, in 1923, just 1 year after the murders, the villagers made a decision. They would tear it down. Brick by brick, board by board, the cursed structure was dismantled. The walls that had witnessed unspeakable horror were reduced to rubble, as if the villagers believed that destroying the house would somehow erase the evil that had taken root there. But even then, the land refused to forget. Decades later, in the very spot where the farmhouse once stood, a single cross was erected, a quiet memorial to the 6 lives that were taken. But something about the land never felt right. People who visited reported an overwhelming sense of unease, an invisible weight pressing against their chests. Some swore they heard whispers in the wind, low, unintelligible murmurs, as if the voices of the dead still lingered, forever trapped in the place where they had suffered. And then there was the strangest story of all. Years after the house was demolished, a man exploring the area uncovered something buried deep in the soil. A rusted object, corroded with time, a pickaxe. The murder weapon had never been found. Had it been hidden there all along, or had it simply returned? Even today, the mystery of Hinterkaifeck remains unsolved. No one knows who the killer was. No one knows why they stayed after the murders. No one knows where they went. But one thing is certain. Somewhere, deep in the forests of Bavaria, the land still remembers, and perhaps so does the killer. As the years passed, the case of the Hinterkaifeck murders faded into the whispers of history, a grisly chapter that remained unsolved, buried beneath time and mystery. But as time often does, it unearthed new leads and new theories began to surface, each more chilling than the last. Then came the most unsettling possibility of all. A breakthrough of sorts, though in truth it was more of a ghost from the past than any clear revelation. A man named Karl Gabriel. Karl had been Victoria Gabriel's husband, a soldier who went off to war and was presumed dead. The tragedy of his death had been the catalyst for much of the grief that had plagued the Gruber family. Victoria had been left widowed, and little Josef had been born, carrying the heavy stigma of an uncertain fatherhood. But what if Karl hadn't been killed in the war? What if he had returned? The theory was wild, yet it haunted the edges of the investigation, emerging like a shadow from the dark corners of the unsolved mystery. There were rumors that Karl Gabriel had not in fact perished as thought, but had instead faked his death, slipping back into Bavaria in secret. Perhaps he had returned with vengeance in his heart, either to reclaim his wife or to confront the secret he believed had been hidden from him, the truth about his son. In this theory, it was not just rage that fueled the violence. It was betrayal. Karl would have known his wife's secret. He would have known about the possibility of incest between Victoria and her father, Andreas Gruber. He would have known about the whispers, the shame that followed the Gruber family, the way it cast shadows on everyone who had lived on that farm. And Karl, in his twisted sense of justice, may have decided that his family needed to be punished. The more investigators dug into this theory, the more unsettling connections began to emerge. Some claimed they had seen Karl Gabriel in the area shortly before the murders. A few mentioned that they thought they saw someone matching his description in the village, walking with a deliberate purpose, his face hardened and cold. But the problem was, no one could prove that Karl had returned. His death certificate was intact. The war records were clear. Yet, there were the rumors. There were the whispers, the small, creeping doubts that twisted in the minds of those who recalled the details of the case. The most chilling aspect of this theory was the possibility that the killer had walked in among the dead. That Karl, if he had truly come back, could have been the very person living in the attic, silently biding his time, watching his family, before descending into violence. What if he had simply waited, letting the madness fester within him, until the time was right? What if the murderer was not just someone with a personal vendetta, but someone who had returned to confront a life he thought he had lost? The idea that the killer might have been Victoria's own husband, returning from the dead in a twisted act of vengeance, left a dark stain on the investigation. Yet, even with all these theories, the case remained unsolved. The true identity of the murderer, whether it was Karl Gabriel, someone from the Gruber family's past, or a stranger, slipped further and further from reach, each new idea raising more questions than it answered. And so, as the years passed, the mystery of Hinterkaifeck, its dark, twisted truths, became one of the most infamous unsolved crimes in history. The land held its secret, the trees whispered it in the wind, and the memory of that night, of the lives taken too soon, would never fade. It would linger. But the killer remains a ghost, slipping through the cracks of time, his identity forever lost to the shadows. Hinterkaifeck is no longer a farmhouse, but a legend, a place whose name has become synonymous with fear and mystery, etched into the annals of history as one of the most chilling unsolved crimes. The haunting image of a family slaughtered, the eerie traces of a killer who lived among the bodies for days, continues to hold a grip on the imagination of all who hear the tale. But even as the years fade into decades, the legacy of Hinterkaifeck persists. The land, the story, the unanswered questions, they remain. And while we may never know the true identity of the killer, the question remains, why was this family chosen? What drove a person to commit such an unthinkable act? And most terrifying of all, could the truth ever be discovered? The whispers of Hinterkaifeck continue to echo through history, its unsolved mystery a chilling reminder that some questions may never have an answer. The farm may be gone, but its legacy endures. We may never find out who did it, we may never understand why, but one thing is certain, the truth will always remain just out of reach, tucked away in the shadows of time. But if you're captivated by this story, if the enigma of Hinterkaifeck has stirred something within you, if you're hungry for more chilling tales from the darkest corners of history, make sure you never miss an episode. Subscribe now, because the shadows still whisper, and we're just getting started. You won't want to miss the stories that follow. Join us as we continue to unravel the mysteries that history tried to bury. Click that subscribe button and let the truth find its way into the light. One story at a time.